Webinar in the semester, and we are pleased to have with us Michael Pesko, professor of economics at the University of Missouri and prolific researcher in the area of substance use and abuse and in the impact evaluation of health policies in general. Mike will be talking about pharmaceutical drug regulation and mortality, evidence from e-cigarettes. Thanks so much, Mike, for being here. One small notice before beginning. If you have any questions and answers, Hans will be handling them. So please write them in the chat and he will interrupt Mike at the right moment. And with that, Mike, the floor is all yours. Thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much to the organizers for inviting us. We're really excited to present our paper for you guys and kick off your season. Yeah, we'll be presenting my co-author Christian Science. He's a PhD candidate at Georgia State University. He is attending and he may answer select questions. But our paper is entitled Pharmaceutical Drug Regulation and Mortality, Evidence from E-Cigarettes. And this work is funded by the National Institutes of Health and by the National Cancer Institute and the Food and Drug Administration. Usual disclaimers regarding government work apply, and we do not hold them responsible for anything that we do or say in our paper. So to kick off here, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States is tasked with regulating pharmaceutical drugs and approving new drugs. So the FDA drug approval process we could describe as lengthy, expensive, and uncertain. A few stylized facts to support that is the average time it takes to bring a new pharmaceutical compound to market is 15 years through the FDA. And firm spending on approved compounds average 2.9 billion, and this includes post-approval monitoring. And only about 12% of new compounds approved for human subjects testing are eventually approved for marketing. So low probability approvals. Even for drugs that drug companies have put a lot of money into already to get it to the point at which it's being tested in humans. And then even after you get approved, there's expensive post-market surveillance and high regulatory barriers for making even small changes to drugs after initial marketing approval is received. So the FDA drug regulation, it represents a trade-off between drug safety efficacy, and that's why all of these costs exist, right? And speed. So I think it's fair to say that we have a system that prioritizes safety and efficacy at the expense of speed, and it taking a long time to bring new compounds and new drugs to market. So, economists have been very interested in, what effect does the drug regulation process have, right? And in particular, what kind of natural experiments exist that allow us to study the effect that this drug regulation is having. And most economists, they've focused on programs that speed up drug review times in the United States. In particular, this Prescription Drug User Fee Act in 1992 provided a pathway for certain drugs to be reviewed more quickly. Keep in mind that review times is only a very small part of the overall drug application process, right? We're talking about 1.3 years out of 15 years on average goes to review times. And so that's the part of this that economists have been studying when there's different programs that make that review time shorter, for example. What impact does it have? And so even though this is just a sliver of the overall variation in what happens in drug review, economists have found a lot of interesting things from that. They found that speeding up drug review times has not had any adverse effect. It increases firm R&D expenditures. It increases drugs in development, and it increases market entry. So overall, it seems like the literature suggests that there aren't really any costs of speeding up drug regulation, and there's benefits. And this study in the bottom bullet found that the program writ large, the 1992 program, increased social surplus by 14 to 31 billion per year. And they estimate an upper bound of life years lost to 56,000. So some cost found in this study, but modest compared to the gains. So research on social welfare implications of FDA drug regulation is almost exclusively focused on variation in drug review times, as I mentioned. And so our question is related, but a little bit different. And we ask, what effect could a blanket exemption from all aspects of FDA drug regulation have on social welfare? And so we evaluate a single drug, e-cigarettes, that was unexpectedly exempted from FDA drug regulation in 2011 due to change in federal law. And so note that this allowed e-cigarettes then to bypass the drug approval process that takes on average 15 years, right, to bring a product to market. And then also it allowed e-cigarettes to avoid post-market surveillance activities and costs associated with that. And so this is a much bigger, for this specific drug, a much bigger shock with respect to its relationship to the FDA than just simply changing review times. And so we ask, what are the welfare effects of allowing a single drug to go unregulated by the FDA? And how did the drug introduction of NRT and drug exemption of e-cigarettes impact mortality from smoking and smoking cessation? This is the specific context through which we explore this broader question about FDA drug regulation. We're using death certificate data in the United States and different survey data sources with smoking information. Our estimation strategy that we employ is a dose response difference in difference. So we're exploiting differences in smoking rates across different demographic groups prior to NRT introduction or prior to e-cigarette introduction. And then we're comparing the effect that it had for groups with higher baseline smoking rates compared to groups with lower baseline smoking rates in terms of the effect of these drugs on mortality and smoking as a mechanism. And one of our main results is that e-cigarette drug exemption reduced mortality from smoking by 10% per year on average, about 24,000 deaths per year from 2011 to 2019, and provided about 9.2 billion in annual consumer surplus. But now I'll unpack this and show you our estimation and the event studies, et cetera, and you can decide how convincing you find this main result to be. So brief history of this kind of unfolding natural experiment. In August 2006, the Royan V8 e-cigarette began to be imported into the United States. And in March 2009, the FDA declared e-cigarettes to be an unapproved smoking cessation drug and began seizing them at ports of entry. Two e-cigarette companies subsequently took the FDA to court, challenging their declaration that e-cigarettes were a drug and seeking an injunction against these seizures. I think most, legal experts would have predicted these e-cigarette companies at the time had a very weak case. And the FDA had successfully used a strategy where other nicotine products that existed before, they were able to remove them from the marketplace almost immediately on grounds that these were unauthorized smoking cessation medications. So there are some famous examples of this. Before, at one point, somebody tried to bring to market nicotine water. There's a Favor smokeless cigarette that existed in the 80s. There's other examples of this prior to e-cigarettes, in which the FDA, they were able to get these products off the marketplace relatively easily. And the Supreme Court had even looked at it and had ruled that if Congress had not otherwise passed legislation suggesting that the products were tobacco products. For example, Congress has passed legislation taxing cigars. And so the Supreme Court ruled that even if Congress had not said that cigars are tobacco products, the FDA could not regulate them as an unauthorized medicine because Congress had intended them to be a tobacco product, which is something different than a medicine. But anyway, so the case was weak. And then something surprising happened. In June 2009, the Family Smoking Prevention Tobacco Control Act was signed into law. And the Tobacco Control Act gave the FDA new authority to regulate existing tobacco products like cigarettes and a pathway to regulate other nicotine products, such as e-cigarettes potentially, as tobacco products if the FDA deemed them as tobacco products through the federal rulemaking process. And so an unintended effect of this is that it kind of muddied the water regarding congressional intent, because now, you know, the FDA, they said that some things are tobacco products. There's a way to regulate tobacco products through the FDA. And further, the FDA has the authority to include even new products that are not designated as new nicotine products that are not designated as tobacco products in the TCA legislation. There was a pathway to regulate them as tobacco product. And it turns out that tobacco product regulation, it's a much weaker form of regulation than drug regulation, right? And so the e-cigarette companies then, this case is unfolding and these e-cigarettes are being seized. And now they said, hey, the Tobacco Control Act just came into law. We think that the FDA has to regulate us as a tobacco product and not as a drug. And that allowed them to, if it was regulated as a tobacco product, seizures had to end immediately, and the FDA had to enter into this process in which they got their everything in order to regulate them as a tobacco product, and what they could do was much less severe than what they could do to an unauthorized drug. And so the e-cigarette companies, they won this court case in about 2010. So the seizures were lifted. No approval then was needed for new e-cigarette products or modifications, nor post-market surveillance. Product liability laws did remain in place, and e-cigarette companies were routinely sued, whether, you know, for deceptive marketing practices, whether harms from exploding e-cigarettes, product liability law remained. But there was not drug regulation. And e-cigarettes began to be regulated as a tobacco product by the FDA in August of 2016. So it took them that long just to deem e-cigarettes to be a tobacco product. And I mean, this is the new agency that newly was able to regulate tobacco. They had to form that agency. They had to hire a lot of people. They had to go through the federal rulemaking process. And so in this unregulated marketplace, I think it's fair to say e-cigarette innovation exploded. And we're going to show you some evidence from patent applications in a moment. What started as a product not that different from a nicotine inhaler, which is an FDA-regulated drug. The original e-cigarettes were not that different from that. Suddenly, we had all this innovation going on. And we have vape pens, we have refillable cartridges, tanks, chargeable batteries, tanks and mods with more customization, nicotine salts, flavors, etc. Right? To the point that I don't think many of us even think about e-cigarettes any longer as the origins of that being very similar to a drug, right? And now we think of it as a consumer product, I think precisely because all this innovation happened, for better or worse. So the pathway of nicotine replacement therapy innovation has been very different, and this has been consistently regulated as a drug by the FDA. And so this kind of shows the counterfactual world of what if the FDA had been consistently regulating e-cigarettes as drugs. What might this look like? Well, in 1984, a 2 milligram nicotine replacement therapy gum was first marketed. And it took about 10 years before the nicotine amount increased to about 4 milligrams of gum was available in 1993. The gum became over the counter in 1996 and then became flavored for the first time in 1999 and 2000. So it took 9 years before nicotine gum could be sold with the higher nicotine strength, 12 years before it could be sold over the counter, and 15 years before it could be sold with the flavor. Meanwhile, this stuff happened almost overnight with e-cigarettes in the unregulated case. And Cystine is a highly effective smoking cessation drug that has been available in other European countries for decades, and it's not yet approved as a drug in the United States, although one company is trying to bring it to market. And so that kind of, raises concern, I think, that if there's a highly effective smoking cessation drug available elsewhere, not in the United States, is there too much drug regulation in the United States that is impeding access to effective smoking cessation products? And so looking just at patent applications, and we're going to compare the United States, which, as you know, is a country that has regulated nicotine replacement therapy as a drug consistently, right? E-cigarettes were unexpectedly judicially exempted. And then in Australia, they have had e-cigarettes have either been completely illegal or there has been a channel to access them, but extremely onerous to the point where only a few dozen people are able to access them legally through prescriptions annually. And there's no legal sales. They could be potentially legally imported. So very different regulatory regimes surrounding e-cigarettes, but regarding nicotine replacement therapy, nothing that's that different. And so we don't really see any evidence of, when we look at smoking cessation medication patents, we don't really see any evidence of these being different between the United States and Australia. But then when we look at e-cigarette patents, and in particular in 2010, after the e-cigarettes were drug exempted unexpectedly, we see a booming e-cigarette patent application in the United States relative to Australia, about a 270% increase. And so I guess, logical question following this was this innovation beneficial from a public health perspective or not, right? Overall, what was the effect of this extra innovation that was experienced in the United States in the e-cigarette marketplace? Am I supposed to pause for questions, or are you guys going to jump in? I think go ahead, and if there's anything not being able to see the chat, feel free to jump in at any time.
Actually, can I ask one question from the previous graph?
Sure.
Because I just forgot from the slide before. Is there something happening specifically in the US there in 2001?
It does seem like there's maybe something, there's some kind of an uptick there.
Okay, but you don't know like what's any reason for why the two lines sort of diverge?
At that point, yeah, I'm not sure. It doesn't come across this. I don't think it's statistically significant in our regression model when we do just, a dip and dip. But yeah, that's something that we should look at.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I also have another question, Mike, if you don't mind.
No.
I guess maybe this is more like a question for the discussion at the end, but it's sort of in the back of my mind, so I might as well ask it right away. So, are you eventually sort of really going to compare the NRT to e-cigarettes in the sense of like this is really sort of the counterfactual of what would have happened if e-cigarettes were to be regulated as NRT? And what I mean is like I can see especially like I can imagine that among existing smokers, they could be seen as sort of substitutes in terms of smoking cessation tools. But I think the appeal to, for example, younger people, of course, is very, very different, I suppose, right? Is there any 14-year-old who is sort of taking gum of NRTs, right? I mean, I guess that's sort of my question, whether these are truly comparable.
Yeah, that's it's a great question. I think that it might go to this slide help. The next two slides that help a little bit. So this is the original Rurian V8 e-cigarette, right? It's unflavored. It has nicotine concentration strength similar to a nicotine inhaler, which was an FDA-approved smoking cessation product at the time, right? Doesn't seem, it's not not very stylish, like, some of the more modern e-cigarettes. You can't play games with it, like you can with the super recent e-cigarettes, et cetera, right? And so I think this is like the baseline of, what the original e-cigarette was, right? Is I don't think it's that much different than a nicotine inhaler, right? And then I think what we often think about with e-cigarettes is all of this innovation that happened, right? And now we think of e-cigarettes as a consumer product that has a lot of flavors. There's been a lot of changes, maybe that would have happened to nicotine replacement therapy as well had the FDA there not been consistent drug regulation, right? So I think at the original point, they're not that different, right? And they seem really different to us now, because of all that innovation.
Yeah. Okay. No, I got you. Yeah.
I guess that's the argument, right?
Yeah. No, got you. Thanks.
Okay. And so the original e-cigarette versus all the products that are available in a modern day vape shop, right? Like this is innovation at work, right? For better or worse. And if we had a similar picture for nicotine replacement therapy, the original product in 1982, the 2 milligram nicotine gum, and what products people have available today, we wouldn't have much to look at, I don't think, right? We would have a few extra products, right? A few flavors, a few strengths, but nothing like what exists within a modern day vape shop, right? So we have one, they both kind of started from the same place, and then one product didn't innovate, and another product did innovate. And they happen at different times, right? So that makes it a little bit tricky to compare, but that's the argument. Okay. So our estimation strategy, then we use a dose response diff and diff model. And so a theta I here is the demographic groups. We interact each demographic group with the post period. Each demographic group then has a different propensity to smoke. So I'm going to talk about that in a moment. We have a group of fixed effects and year by age fixed effects in the model. And our outcome then is smoking attributable mortality per 1,000 population for each demographic group in a given year. And so the idea is that the beta then will be capturing then the effect of for groups with higher smoking rates at baseline versus lower smoking rates, what effect does the post period have on their mortality relative to the pre-period? Okay, so our smoking rate then, our main a share measure in this demographic shift share diff and diff is a daily smoking from 2005 to 2006. This e-cigarette were introduced in the United States market at the end of 2006. And so the mean daily smoking rate from 2005 to 2006 is about 13.7%, but there's a lot of variation across demographic groups that we exploit in our identification strategy. So the highest daily smoking rate is about 30%, and that's 30 to 34-year-old white white non-Hispanic males living in rural areas of the North, the lowest daily smoking rate is about 5%, and that's 75 to 79-year-old white non-Hispanic female that reside in urban areas of the North. And so the idea then is that the group with the higher smoking rate, the young white male rural northern residing people, they should benefit from e-cigarette introduction about 6 times more than the older white female urban North residents, right? Because they have a smoking rate that's about 6 times higher than those residents, right? By benefiting, we mean in terms of their mortality or in terms of their smoking, which we study as well. And the e-cigarette use from 2016 to 2028 is moderately positively correlated with daily smoking rates from 2005 to 2006. There's a positive correlation there, but it's not 100% correlation. And we also use then for the NRT introduction, then we use NHIS daily smoking data from 1983 with the nicotine replacement therapy gum first becoming available in 1984. So we use the same empirical strategy for both the nicotine replacement therapy introduction and e-cigarette introduction. We apply a Bayesian shrinkage to shrink smoking prevalence based on sampling variance. Groups with fewer respondents contain higher sampling variance. Failing to account for this leads to attenuated causal estimates and larger standard errors. So we shrink estimates of smoking rate closer to the population mean for groups with fewer numbers of survey respondents because there's greater uncertainty in the smoking rate. Turns out we do sensitivity around this, doesn't matter too much. It provides a little more precision to our results, but we use this in our main results to address the obvious concern that some of these demographic groups that we use, they may have relatively few observations. And so the smoking rates might be potentially less reliable than for well-populated groups. And then for our mortality data, we use use death records from 1979 to 2020. And this contains detailed information from death certificates in the US. We create a panel of smoking attributable mortality rates by a demographic group from 1979 to 2019. And we examine ages 30 to 79 in our main analysis, although we look at just everybody 30 years and older. It's a sensitivity analysis. I guess we focus on 30 to 79 in our main analysis because we're interested in how e-cigarette introduction might affect people more in the middle life mortality rather than end of life longevity. Our main analysis focuses on extending life in the middle years. And then causes for smoking attributable mortality, there's a paper that we use that defines these types of mortality. And then within each type of mortality, there is sex-specific smoking attributable fractions that are caused by smoking. For example, lung cancer. I believe the smoking attributable fraction is about 90% of lung cancer cases are caused by smoking, whereas with other types of mortality that are smoking caused, cardiovascular mortality, etc., there's lower shares of that mortality that are caused by smoking. And so we compensate for that in how we construct our outcome. We address, there's some, my co-author, Christian, he would be happy, I'm sure, to discuss all the challenges that there was in trying to standardize this mortality data across all these different years, in which some of the years use ICD-8, some of the years use ICD-9, and others use ICD-10. And a final methodological note is that we use a linear pre-trend projection procedure in our main results. And this has been used by in other seminal papers in the field. And so the idea here is that in equation 2, we're adding a demographic group specific time trend to our main equation. And then we estimate 2 for just the pre-period, and we generate predicted values, and then we use those predicted values then to re-estimate equation 1 that I presented earlier. And so this procedure transforms our outcome from mortality growth to deviations in mortality from predicted growth prior to introduction. And predicted growth is the linear projected trend in outcomes from the pre-period. So we'll show you in a moment that this procedure provides very nice parallel trends. And it's considered an improvement over using just demographic group specific time trends throughout the full period, in which there could be attenuation bias from doing that kind of thing. Instead, we use just the pre-period and project forward in ways that doesn't lead to that type of attenuation bias. Okay, so moving on to results. This is the effect of the nicotine replacement therapy drug introduction in 1984 on mortality. And we don't observe, much evidence of an effect here. The pre-period, the trends appear to be parallel, right? A modest reduction in smoking equivalent mortality of about 1.3%, but this is not statistically significant. And when we move to e-cigarette introduction and mortality, to the left of the first vertical line in the gray area, this is when e-cigarettes were first introduced into the United States. And then to the right of the second vertical line, to the right of the gray space, that's when they were drug exempted, right? And so we kind of consider this in-between period between when the e-cigarettes were introduced and when they were drug exempted to be a transition period, you could think, in which some e-cigarettes were available, some were being seized at ports of entry, right? But there was a lot of uncertainty in this marketplace at the time, and then a lot of that uncertainty faded away after the drug exemption. So maybe some evidence of a modest increase in the mortality might be trending modestly positively in the pre-period prior to introduction. But it seems like in the transition period, there's some evidence then of emerging declines, although none of those are statistically significant, those coefficients, right? And then the first evidence of statistically significant reductions then emerged in 2011, and with increasing declines in the years that follow. And so including, so the full post period after drug introduction, we find a reduction in smoking attributable mortality of about 7.7%. And then if we focus just on the drug exemption period, 2011 forward, we see a reduction in smoking attributable mortality of about 9.9%. And these are statistically significant. Now, if we look at a mechanism, the primary mechanism we suspect is through changes in smoking rates, right? And in this case here, this is using National Health Interview Survey data. Unfortunately, the behavioral risk factor surveillance system data, there was an unfortunate survey design change in 2011 that makes us prefer that estimate a little bit less. But we do show that in the paper, and in the same, we find basically the same pattern of results across all three of our survey data sources. although we're going to focus just on National Health Interview Survey here, right? In the transition period, maybe some evidence of reductions already in smoking while these e-cigarettes were available, right? But with a lot of regulatory uncertainty. And then it appears that the benefits increase even more in the post period after drug exemption, right? And so about a 2 percentage point reduction since 2007, we attribute to e-cigarette introduction. And just focusing on the drug exemption period, we observe about a 4.3 percentage point reduction in smoking rates. So if we look at some other measures of smoking that are available in the survey data, similar results when we focus on daily smoking. We look at average days smoked past month, about a 1 day decrease in smoking since 2007 that could be attributed to e-cigarettes. And then the average cigarette smoked per day, about a half of a stick less per day since 2007. So some takeaways. So we find that e-cigarette drug exemption, we estimate that it saved about 760,000 life years in total from 2011 to 2019, about 75,000 life years annually. It generated about, well, one other note about that first bullet that I found interesting, just thinking how can we think about this effect relative to other the benefits of other drugs, right? And one estimate is that the early HIV drugs through the year 2000, that's estimated to have saved about 3 times as many life years as what we estimate in our study. So we think that e-cigarette introduction from 2011, or e-cigarette drug exemption from 2011 to 2019, that time period had about 1/3 the benefit in terms of life years saved as HIV drugs through the year 2000. Then in terms of social welfare calculations, we estimate that these life years led to 82 billion in extra consumer surplus, about 9.2 billion annually, making a conservative assumption that 1 life year saved equals about $100,000. And reduced population level current smoking by an average about 4.3 percentage points after 2011, or 7 million net quitters. That 4.3 percentage point, that's the median across our different survey data sources. We have 3 different data sources. And then for nicotine replacement therapy drug introduction, unfortunately, we can rule out NRT averting more than 11,000 deaths each year. And so relatively little effect, if any, of nicotine replacement therapy. So we do, a lot of probing of these results, obviously. I guess this is showing heterogeneity and who benefited from e-cigarette drug exemption more than other groups. And I guess, one interesting finding is that there's not a lot of evidence that Asian Pacific Islanders or that Hispanics, that they benefited much from this. And that's consistent with these groups having relatively low smoking rates, right? And some of the race ethnic groups that benefited the most are the groups with higher smoking rates, in particular whites and American Indians. Otherwise, some evidence of younger age groups potentially benefiting by more, potentially consistent with higher e-cigarette utilization rates among those groups. In terms of robustness, we do a lot of checking of this, obviously. Some things that we tried were, so our mean estimates is the first bullet point here. And I guess maybe I should have oriented you to the graph first. The blue dots, that's showing the percent change in smoking attributable mortality. So use the bottom axis for the blue dots. And then the red hollow circles, that is showing annual life years gain lost in thousands. And so use the top part of the graph for to read those effects. But focusing just mostly on the blue dots here, in comparing those to our mean estimates, which are shown at the top of the figure. Weighting doesn't seem to matter too much. Results are pretty consistent, whether we use weights or not. We're curious if are our results being driven by our smoking share that we construct from 2005 to 2006? Like if we go back further in time and use the smoking share from 1997 to 1998, does that affect things much? And that doesn't seem to make much of an impact. We use there are a few different approaches. The pre-trend adjustment procedure that I mentioned, there's a little bit of nuance across different authors and how to implement that. We used a slightly different approach, yields basically the same finding. We also dropped our don't use urbanicity and region in our share measure. We reconstruct our demographic groups to avoid using any geography, just to make sure that there's not some kind of geographical specific shock happening in the time of e-cigarette introduction that could be explaining some of our findings. So we regenerate our data using just national groups. If anything, that seems to increase our findings. We bootstrap standard errors. We use additional fixed effects and by year fixed effects. So we use age by year fixed effects, I think, is in our main analysis. Actually, I'm going to let Christian maybe jump in really quick. Christian, if you wouldn't mind, what's the additional fixed effects that we use exactly?
So in our main specification, we include year by age group, 5-year age fixed effects. In the additional fixed effect specification, we add gender by year, race by year, and all the other demographic categories that we use. Urban status by year, census region by year, fixed effects to try to capture the time-varying heterogeneity across those groups.
Thank you, Christian. We don't use the shrinking procedure. I mentioned that before. We keep the elderly. We don't drop those. And then we did an extended pre-period as well because we were curious, could there be some, the master settlement agreement happened in 1998. There are other national things going on in tobacco control. And do we see any evidence if we look back further in time of like that should show up in our event studies, like of effects, right? And we don't see evidence that using further data earlier that affects things substantially. Looking then, one of the strengths of the mortality data is we can break apart different types of mortality, right? And so does this kind of support, e-cigarettes being the mechanism here explaining this reduced mortality? We think that there's evidence of that, and the types of mortality that increase the most. I guess if we look at the bottom part here, the biggest change came from acute onset causes of, and so these are the types of mortality for which smoking cessation could have a more immediate effect versus types of mortality in which smoking cessation could affect that type of mortality, but with considerable lag. And so we see evidence that the faster changing types of mortality were the ones that were reduced by the most after drug exemption. So we think that that supports our the e-cigarette introduction drug exemption pathway. Okay, covered that. So you know, our methodology, we follow Alcott and Rapkin. They had a very nice AEJ economic policy publication in 2022 that also used this demographic shift share, DIF and DIF, right? And they use it to study smoking. They don't look at mortality, right? And so I guess you could say that, you know, maybe an ideal exposure, which neither of our papers has, right, is the extent to which e-cigarette availability affects smoking and ultimately smoking attributable mortality. And so to capture this ideal exposure, we're using baseline smoking rates in 2005 to 2006. In Alcott and Rafkin, they're using vaping rates in 2016 to 2018, right? So I guess, you know, one benefit of what we're doing in our share is that our share is being created before the e-cigarette marketplace existed. And so we argue it's less affected by reverse causality concerns. For example, smoking rates could be impacting vaping rates, right? In common shocks that could be affecting both use, right? By using smoking rates in a baseline period and then studying the effect that that has on smoking in subsequent periods, that helps us to avoid some of these concerns. You might say that, well, the criticism of our measure is that you know, if people don't, just because it's available, does, like, if people don't use it, right? Or, you know, then how would it benefit you, right? I mean, there could also be a case though that e-cigarettes, there could be spillover effects happening as well, though, right? If, for example, if a child uses an e-cigarette, maybe a college age child uses an e-cigarette to quit smoking, and their parents observe that, right? And maybe they're inspired by the child's no longer smoking. You know, maybe they quit themselves, right? Or maybe this works through a spouse or something like that, right? But the point is that there could be people that benefit from reductions in smoking that e-cigarette causes in terms of their own smoking reductions, even if they don't use e-cigarettes. And so that's a benefit of relying just on a baseline smoking rate measure, and that it captures these spillover effects. And you know, there's another way to kind of ask ourselves, are our estimates reasonable or not, is that there are a few two ex ante kind of simulation models that are trying to forecast what the effect of e-cigarettes is anticipated to have on mortality going forward, right? In Hawaii 2024, in her job market paper, she estimates that a hypothetical vape ban 2019 would lead to 11 million fewer life years over the life course for those ages 12 and up. David Levy, 2021, estimates that e-cigarettes will save nearly 40 million life years from 2013 to 2060. And so we're providing an ex post estimate here, right? Maybe an early one, right? Through 2019. And we find about 760,000 life years. And so, you know, it's difficult to compare. You know, we have different time horizons here, right? Different, you know, I guess that's the main issue, right? So we're just very early, right? But I think that, you know, when Christian and I looked at it, we thought that this is reasonable. If anything, our estimates might even be a little bit small relative to what relative to what some of these other projections are estimating. And you know, another calibration exercise we did is we compared, well, what's the smoking reduction to the mortality reduction, and is this reasonable or not? And so we estimate 1 life year gain for every 100 fewer smoking years, or a smoking year to life year pass through of about 1%. And you know, we thought that that seems reasonable. And so in wrapping up here, I guess some limitations. Are our results generalizable to other therapeutic drug classes, right? I mean, I think we're trying to make a broader point about FDA drug regulation, right? And, you know, how generalizable is this particular smoking cessation, this therapeutic class of smoking cessation medications? You know, maybe there's some evidence here of that the marketplace was not providing for the demand that people had. And then when people had access to smoking cessation drugs that outside of the regulated process, right, it improved their longevity. Is that specific to the smoking cessation therapeutic drug class, or is there lessons that we can learn from this for other therapeutic drug classes? I think that's a reasonable question. You know, they do align though our findings that basically we conclude that the FDA may be over-regulating the drug supply based on what we can see based on this particular smoking cessation therapeutic drug class. And that resonates with other literature that I reviewed to start, in which looking at review times, for example, they find evidence that, you know, FDA drug regulation has little benefit and a lot of cost. You know, some of the numbers that we provide in terms of mortality, it's difficult to disentangle the effect of e-cigarette introduction for drug exemption, obviously. And then, of course, e-cigarettes are going to impact mortality with the late nature. So we're only going to be able to see some of that mortality benefit through 2019. And there could be remaining benefit for people that have already been impacted by e-cigarettes before 2019 that could be happening in the decades to come, right? So we might think of our mortality estimate that we have through 2019 as an underestimate of the effect of e-cigarette availability through 2019. And then finally, you know, we study the effects of e-cigarette introduction drug exemption on mortality for adults 30 years of age and older, right, and find benefits, right? But of course, people could reasonably be concerned about the effect that this e-cigarette introduction drug exemption has on children and younger people, right? And you know, sure, we estimate some social welfare gains of e-cigarette introduction drug exemption for older adults, but could that be offset in future years, or sizably reduced in future years based on what goes on with kids, right? I mean, we did estimate our model for under 30s, even though, you know, very few people died from smoking attributable causes, right? We didn't see anything to suggest that there's an increase happening. I think we saw just null results there. I guess, you know, I mean, you know, there's quasi-experimental evidence suggesting that e-cigarettes are displacing smoking even among youth. I think that's the predominant, you know, finding. And so, you know, based on that quasi-experimental work that, you know, many other economists have nicely contributed to, it seems like maybe e-cigarettes are benefiting youth, right? At least in terms of their smoking rates, right? So that would be some evidence to suggest that this pattern we observe will probably not be undone in future years. And then just descriptively, I do find this interesting and maybe different than what people might think the state of the land is, at least in the United States. This is showing tobacco use rates and e-cigarette use rates over time, right? And I think very encouraging from a public health perspective. In 2011, we had a youth tobacco use rate over the past month of about 25%, and it's down to about 12% in 2023, and this includes e-cigarettes, right? And then of that use, most of that use is coming from e-cigarettes. So you could say that that's a good thing that, you know, the that the composition of remaining tobacco users is safer, right? Tobacco use rates have fallen by 50%, right, since 2011, and of the remaining users, they're using safer forms of tobacco. So you could say that this paints an encouraging picture, right? And certainly a much better picture than one that existed at the end of 2019, right? In which, this is the height of the Juul epidemic. And actually for a period of time there was higher tobacco use rates that were happening, and that was certainly concerning. But as of 2023, the situation looks a lot better in the United States, and all of this is that leads us to think that these benefits that we see are unlikely to be sizably offset in the future years. And last slide here, I think we're doing great on time. For e-cigarettes and NRT, we find that FDA drug regulation reduces innovation, diminishes social welfare. Do we need drug regulation, or is product liability law sufficient? Phillipson kind of provocatively asked that question before. And up until now, we've never had a chance to really look at this in a natural experiment setting, and e-cigarettes provide a cool way to study this, in which product liability law exists. E-cigarette companies have been routinely sued, and they've probably responded to those lawsuits, right, in sizable ways. And so, is that sufficient to keep drug companies responsible, or is drug regulation also needed on top of that? Our results may suggest product liability law may work. I guess finally, just in terms of speaking about, is there anything we can conclude from this about FDA tobacco product regulation? And now the FDA is regulating e-cigarettes as tobacco products, right? And I guess we might recommend, not overly aggressive regulation of tobacco products, because it does seem that of e-cigarettes as tobacco products, because it does seem like there have been some gains to public health from minimum regulation, and so hopefully tobacco product regulation doesn't reach the same level that drug regulation reaches, for example. All right, I think I'll stop here and answer any other questions people may have.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mike. Well, let me first look around to see whether there's any questions. Anna?
Yes, thanks for the presentation, Mike. No, my question, I have like a couple of concerns related to the time to death. So it seems to be very fast, the effects on mortality. And the other one is whether like advances of medical technology, in particular severe cases like extreme cancer treatments and things like that, how could that affect your results?
Yeah. So to your latter question, I guess we found it encouraging that it wasn't just one type of mortality that was being reduced, because that would, if there was, that could suggest more of a story that there was some kind of technology that happened around 2017, like that affected cancer, right? It's not just cancer mortality that's being reduced, though. We also see, benefits in other types of mortality that are smoking attributable, right? So kind of the spreading around of the benefits in terms of all the different types of mortality that are smoking caused, we think that reduces the concern about it being like a specific medical intervention, right? And then in terms of the timing, I guess we see we see almost immediate smoking reductions, right? And then 4 years later, we see the first statistically significant evidence of a mortality of reduction, right? So approximately a 4-year lag between mortality and reductions in smoking reductions. We think that offsets some of that concern. It does still seem a little bit fast, though. And one thing that we've speculated is that that the very early users of e-cigarettes, I mean, this is a self-selected sample, right? And for example, a lot of people, they have heart attacks that are smokers, right? And in the early years, maybe they were the ones that were reaching for an e-cigarette, knowing that if I keep smoking, I'm almost surely going to die soon, right? And the e-cigarette might have been what helped them to quit. So the point being that there could be faster reductions than we might typically think if the super sick were the ones that were using early.
Thank you.
I do have a couple of questions, but I can also write them in an email. I see that we're already 30 past the hour.
Well, I guess you
Cool.
can ask one and then we can finish.
Okay. Yeah, if no one else has. Tina, did you want to ask something?
No, that's okay. You can
Okay.
ask your question.
Maybe just one question on the welfare. Like, do I understand it correctly that you only look at the actual realized mortality? You're not sort of simulating any future mortality for, let's say, currently 40-year-olds who stop smoking, right? As a result of the
Yeah, that's I think Christian can correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, no, it's just an ex post analysis of
Right.
and we're not simulating anything.
So that could potentially be another reason why you're underestimating sort of the welfare gains if you would sort of simulate or project.
Yeah, that's right. And I was I tried to mention that not very well, I'm sure, but that the some of the benefits on mortality will, for people that benefited in terms of their smoking reduction through 2019, those mortality benefits could continue to extend well into the
Okay, so I guess it's time. Maybe if you want to stay a bit afterwards, if anyone else has a question, but I think that we'll just say goodbye here. Thanks, Mike, very much for your presentation. I would like to announce the next speaker, who will be Meltem Daisal on October 6th. She will be talking about antidepressant treatment in childhood. And well, we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Yep, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.